Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. This time we continue our reading of Storm in the Village by Miss Reed. We are in the midst of the public inquiry about the housing development. As it happened, old Mr. Miller was the next to put his case, or rather Mr. Lovejoy, his much-tried solicitor, did his best by judicious questioning of his client to set Mr. Miller's various losses before the inspector. He had an uphill job. It had taken him 20 minutes to make his points about material losses in crops and hard cash and the depreciation of Mr. Miller's remaining property if this estate were to be built, and he was flagging a little. Mr. Miller, seated by him, looked about him with button-bright eyes. He had missed his usual nap, but he was still fighting fit. Mr. Lovejoy had already given a heart-rending account of his frail client being wrested from his birthplace and tottering sorrowfully towards his grave, leaving a homeless family behind him. Mr. Miller had listened with barely concealed impatience, drumming on his knee in a way which his solicitor found peculiarly tiresome. He took a deep breath and embarked on the last part of his case. "Is it any wonder," he asked, "that my client's health has given way, his appetite has gone, and he can no longer get about as he did?" "Fiddlesticks," rejoined his crusty old gentleman, rising to his feet. "I just ate a partridge, drunk a pint of porter, and walked to the Blackbird and back, my boy." Mr. Lovejoy did his best to retrieve the situation amidst some laughter. "As you can see, my client is a courageous man, as full of spirit as he is full of years. But I can assure you, and his doctor can testify if need be, that he is not the same man since the shadow of this project fell across his birthright." He gave a polite bow and put a solicitous hand under Mr. Miller's elbow, much to that gentleman's annoyance. Together they resumed their seats. The Ag Man, as Mr. Maughan had so euphoniously called the officer of the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, spoke next, and if he did not actually mention gold dust, he certainly made it clear that this was indeed a valuable agricultural area, farmed intensively by an enlightened owner who kept the land in good heart and was a national asset. It would be a crime to see it built upon. He was sure, too, that taking the long view, the building of a new town in this agricultural area would create a great deal of unemployment troubles for the farmers, already harassed by the shift to the towns of their erstwhile farm workers. It would be an unsettling influence for all concerned. He agreed with the Director of Education that these people would be better placed near existing towns. Outside, the rumble of thunder made itself heard above the steady drone of the traffic in Caxley High Street. The room was so dim that the lights had to be switched on, and despite the open windows, the room was oppressively hot. The list of speakers lying before the inspector gradually shortened as the afternoon wore on. Mrs. Bradley had her say, and a very spirited one it was. No one, in her opinion, had really stressed the important point, which was that this was artistically one of the most important landscapes in England. She reminded her hearers forcefully of all Dan Crockford's many pictures of the spot. She adjured them to look once again at the splendors that hung, in far too dim a light to be sure, in their own town hall. It would be a lasting disgrace to Caxley if this generation sold its birthright to the authorities for a mess of pottage, and denied its children their rightful inheritance. She sat down amid some applause. The proceedings wound on, statements, cross-examinations, and answers, and nearer grew the thunder. The rain began to beat down like straight steel rods, and the windows had to be shut. It was stifling as the last speaker rose. He was an official from the Council for the Preservation of Rural England, and he was young, ardent, and appallingly long-winded. He agreed at length with Mrs. Bradley. He reiterated at length the beauties of the range of downs involved. He pointed on the map that still embellished the wall behind the inspector's head to the ancient green road that ran clean through the proposed site. That alone, surely, made the whole project impossible. He sat down as Mr. Devon Forbes rose to answer. The authority had as much feeling for the historic past as had the council, which Mr. Brown had the honor of representing. If he took trouble to look more closely at the map, he would have seen that the ancient road was to remain as it had always been, with no building within a number of specified feet. If he remembered rightly, just such a situation had arisen in Berkshire at Harwell, where the authority had taken the greatest pains to preserve a stretch of ancient roadway. The Icknield Way, he understood, for posterity, although it ran through quite a large portion of the authority's property. His tone implied that the recalcitrant roadway, like a wayward child, had had every consideration from a much-tried nursemaid. The inspector looked at the deputy clerk, who rose and said that that brought the case for the county council to a close. The inspector thanked all those who had attended this necessarily lengthy inquiry, promised to put his report before the minister with all possible speed, and began to put his papers together. A devastating crack split the sky. There was a sizzling noise, and the lights went out. Through the murk came laughter, the clatter of those wicked chairs, and above all the voice of the inspector. "And that," he said loudly, "ends our enquiry." There was a certain amount of confusion in the twilit hall below. The vicar waited for Mr. Maughan, from whom he had become parted, and saw a very young man approach Mrs. Bradley. They stood together at the head of the steps down to the pavement and effectively held up the flow of traffic. "I thought you were wonderful," said the young man, flushing pink. "I'm Dan's great-nephew, another Dan, but Dan Johnson." "No!" squeaked Mrs. Bradley in delight. "Not Lucy's boy. Lucy Crockford was my grandmother. Wonderful! Yes, I can see you have her eyes. Come home to tea, won't you? Stay to supper. Stay the night. Stay a week or two." "I can't do that, I'm afraid," he laughed. "I'm due in Oxford next week. I go up on Tuesday." "Which college?" "Worcester. Near Mac Fisheries?" The young man wrinkled his brow with mental effort. "I don't think so." "No matter. I often shop in Oxford. You must have lunch with me at Eastgate. Heavens, how rude people are pushing like this." "We'd better move," agreed the young man, and they walked together down the steps and out of the vicar's earshot. "What a scrum!" gasped Mr. Maughan, arriving. "I got cornered by some ass who wanted minute instructions on how to feed a captive tawny owl." "The price of fame," the vicar said benignly, leading the way to the car park. Rivulets chortled along the gutters of Caxley, and the good citizens picked their way among the puddles. The downpour had stopped with the same dramatic suddenness with which it had started, and although black clouds still hung in the sky over the distant downs, the sun shone. Sparkling raindrops slid along the telegraph wires, and the awnings were beaded with diamonds. The vicar and Mr. Maughan drove up Caxley High Street, splashing sedately through the water and heading toward the black cloud that hung, like the threat which still lowered, above the two villages. "Look at that!" exclaimed Mr. Maughan, ducking his head and peering up into the sky above the windscreen. The vicar followed his gaze. Arched above them, a flamboyant and iridescent arc across the dark cloud shone a rainbow. The vicar smiled at his friend. "Let us hope it is an augury," he said, and, stepping on the accelerator, he set the nose of his rattling car on the road to Fairacre. Part 4. The Calm After the Storm. Chapter 19. Mrs. Coggs Fights a Battle. When Joseph Coggs fled in frantic despair from the domestic hell of Tyler's Row, he had no plan in mind but escape from intolerable conditions. The wind howled in the trees above the road as he ran headlong through the rain-swept darkness toward the center of the village. He still burned with injustice and was as frightened by the magnitude of his own rage as he was by the fury of the storm around him. Habit led his steps toward the school, and still sobbing, he found himself at the school gate with the bulk of St. Patrick's looming blackly against the dark sky. All was in darkness except for a faint ruddy glow from behind the red curtains of the schoolhouse. But Joseph was in no mood to approach authority. Authority meant his mother, his father, scoldings, railings, and forced obedience to unbearable circumstances. Joseph turned his back upon the light and looked with awe at the church. It would be dry in there, but nothing would induce him to find shelter in a building which, to his superstitious mind, might house the dead as well as the living. What should he do? He became conscious for the first time of his own position. His clothes were so wet that he could feel the cold trickles running down his shivering body. He was dizzy with hunger and fatigue. He had left home, and there was no going back. He walked slowly and hopelessly to the school door. It was locked as he had expected. The great heavy ring which acted as handle to the Gothic door lay cold and wet in Joseph's hand, denying him entrance. Joseph leant his head against the rough wood and wept anew. Tears and rain dripped together upon his soaked jersey, but as he rested there, abandoned to grief, a small metallic sound revived his hopes. The rain was making music upon the empty milk crates beside the door scraper. Those 2 milk crates, piled one on top of the other, would enable him to reach the lobby window, and Joseph knew full well that that window had a broken catch. He dragged the crates noisily along by the wall and struggled up. Sure enough, the tall, narrow window tilted up under pressure, and Joseph struggled through into the lobby, closing the window behind him. Breathlessly, he made his way into his classroom, not daring to switch on the light lest he should be discovered. It was warmer in here, for the tortoise stove still gave out a dying heat, but it was terrifyingly eerie. The floorboards creaked under Joseph's squelching canvas-topped shoes as he approached the stove. He held his thin hands over its black bulk and looked fearfully about him at the shadowy classroom. The moon face of the clock gleamed from the wall. Its measured tick was the only companionable sound in the room. The charts and papers pinned to the partition glimmered like pale ghosts, and the ecclesiastical windows, gaunt and narrow, filled Joseph with the same superstitious terror that St. Patrick's had done. He turned again to the comfort of the homely stove, and remembering the little trapdoor at its foot, which he had seen Mrs. Pringle adjust, he bent to examine it through the bars of the fire guard. He lifted the metal flap and was enchanted to see a red spark fall from the embers. He crouched down beside it and with growing wonder watched the gray cinders glow again as the air blew through. His spirits rose as the warmth began to grow, and he set about making himself more comfortable. He crept back into the windy, stone-floored lobby and collected 2 coats which had been left there. He stripped off his wet jersey, his poor shirt, and his heavy wet trousers, wrung them out into the coke scuttle, and spread them to dry along the fire guard. His ragged vest was almost as wet, but modesty made him continue to wear it. He fought his way into a coat much too small for him, spread the other on the floor by the stove, and lay down, well content, for he could look straight into the minute cavern of glowing cinders inside the trapdoor. He was almost happy. In the arrangements he had made for his own comfort, he had forgotten the past miseries which had led to his flight. Only one thing bothered him, an all-invading hunger beside which every other trouble dwindled into insignificance. His mind bore upon this problem with increasing urgency. What was there to eat in school? He remembered Miss Reed's sweet tin, but he knew that the cupboard would be locked. Earlier in the evening he would have wept at this remembrance, but he was past tears now. To survive, he must eat. To survive, to eat, he must think. He sat up, looked round him, and relief flooded over him, for there in the shadows near the door was the nature table, and he himself had helped Miss Reed to arrange fruits of the autumn. He scrambled to his feet and ran toward this richness. A shiny cooking apple, as big as his baby brother's head, was the finest prize the table yielded, but there were a few nuts and a spray of blackberries. Gleefully he returned to his coat on the floor and sat cross-legged. In the shadowy schoolroom, his tear-stained face gilded in the glow from the stove, Joseph Coggs thankfully munched his apple while the storm raged furiously outside. In 10 minutes' time, with every scrap of food gone, he lay curled up, sleeping the sleep of the completely exhausted. He woke once during the night. The rain had ceased, and a pallid moon shone fitfully between the ragged clouds that raced across the sky. A mouse, disturbed by his movements, scurried across the floor to its home behind the raffia cupboard, and Joseph caught a glimpse of its vanishing tail. The storm had gone out, and the room felt much colder. The draught from the window stirred the papers on the walls, and there was a little sibilant whispering from the straw which had escaped Miss Pringle's broom as it moved to and fro across the floorboards in which it was caught. Joseph lay there quite unafraid. What had happened was too big, too important, too far away to take in. He was drained of all feeling. Nothing really mattered now except the fact that he was safe and at peace. Someone else must bother about his mother, the howling babies, the upturned lamp, the wretched chickens. He was too tired. He rolled over again upon his hard bed, conscious only of the relief of being alone with enough room to stretch himself in quietness and shelter. It was there, fast asleep on the floor before the cold stove, that Mrs. Pringle found him at 8 o'clock the next morning. At Tyler's Row, Joseph's flight had had unexpected consequences. Before Mrs. Coggs had had time to collect her scattered wits, her husband had entered. Work had stopped early on the building where Arthur Coggs was engaged because of the torrential rain. The overturned lamp was now upright and burning, but the children continued to whimper, awaiting their tea, and the house still reeked of paraffin oil. "Where's the grub?" growled Arthur Coggs, slinging his wet cap and coat onto that same chair which had upset his firstborn. "And shut your noise," he brawled at the sniveling youngsters. It was too much for Mrs. Coggs. Years of abuse, hard words, and hard blows, culminating in this disastrous day, made her suddenly and loquaciously bold. "Shut your own!" she screamed at her flabbergasted husband. He began to raise a massive fist, but she advanced upon him with such fire sparking from her eyes that he stepped back. "Joe's run off, and I don't blame him. Any more of your tongue, and I'll go after him, and you can look after the kids yourself." Now then, began Arthur Coggs in a menacing growl. "Mind what you're—" "I mean it, straight," panted his distracted wife. "I can't stand no more. I'm off to the police." She meant to ask for their help in finding Joseph, but her husband's guilty conscience construed this last remark as a reflection on his own wrongdoing. Alarmed at this fresh independence displayed by his wife, he became conciliatory. "Here, don't take on like that. What if Joe's gone off? He'll come back for his tea, you see." "That he won't," responded Mrs. Coggs. "I'm off after him." She began to push past him to the door, but Arthur Coggs stopped her. "You make us a cup of tea, gal, and I'll have a look round," he said gently. He put on his coat and cap again and went thoughtfully out into the downpour. His wife watched him go grimly, arms akimbo. The worm had turned. He returned 15 minutes later. The children were seated at the table, demolishing thick doorsteps of bread and margarine. His own plateful of baked beans and rashers stood ready for him. "Anyone seen him?" cried his wife anxiously, hand on heart. "No, but I told old Lamb at the post office, and he said he'd keep a lookout." "Fat lot of good that was," commented his wife. Arthur Coggs lied quickly. "And I saw the copper on his bike. Going on home he was, so I let him know our Joe were out somewhere." His wife looked at him suspiciously. "It's the truth," protested Arthur, beginning to bluster. "And I'll tell you another thing. If he ain't home before bedtime, we'll leave the door unlocked so his kid can get in." "I'll go out myself," answered his wife resolutely, "as soon as this lot's finished with." She looked at her gobbling brood, at the poor scanty meal, the cracked plates, the meager fire, and at her shifty, lying bully of a husband. The newfound fire burnt steadily within her and gave her unquenchable courage. She turned upon him again furiously. "You've driven our Joe to this," she told him shrilly. "I went for him, I knows that, but only because I was that worried and fed up. If I'd had a good man behind me all these years, there'd be no need for us all living worse than pigs. Things is going to alter here, Arthur Coggs, or mark my word, your face is on a lot of your own. I'm off otherwise, back to service, with good meals and decent people. I've been a fool too long, I reckon." The tears were running down her cheeks as she ended this tirade. The children watched her open-mouthed, and Arthur Coggs, for once, was beyond speech. Mrs. Pringle presented Joseph Coggs to me just as I was about to lift my breakfast egg out of the saucepan. I had never seen a child look so exhausted. "Asleep on the floor," Mrs. Pringle said dramatically. "Lord, that give me a start. What on earth can that old bundle of rags be a-doing down there?" I thought to myself, when all of a sudden it moved. Mrs. Pringle threw her hands up in astonishment. "And been there all night," he says. "What his poor ma be doing?" Be a dear and take a message down," I begged. "The stoves can wait. I'll give him breakfast while you're gone." Pleased to be the bearer of such momentous tidings, Mrs. Pringle hurried off with not the slightest trace of a limp, whilst I returned to my visitor. "Do you like boiled eggs?" I asked him. He nodded dazedly. His eyes were puffy, his face and hands filthy, and I led him to the sink while his 2 eggs boiled. I stripped the child's dirty clothes from his waist up and gave him a thorough wash as he stood silently impassive. He was pathetically thin, every rib showing, and his ebony shoulder blades protruded like a fledgling's wings. Here and there was an ugly bruise, and the poverty-stricken smell of accumulated dirt and neglect hung around his frail form. I wished that I had time to bathe him properly, but after redressing him and combing his matted hair, I looked upon my breakfast guest with pride. I let him eat before doing a little tentative questioning. The child seemed too listless, too dazed, and too bewildered to do more than grunt a yes or no to my few queries, but it was enough to give me a true and heartbreaking glimpse of all that Joseph had endured throughout his short life. By the time his mother arrived, I had already decided that someone in authority would have to tackle this family business. I had foreseen a forlorn, negative hopelessness from Mrs. Coggs, but was pleasantly surprised to find that, though red-eyed with weeping, she was in fighting trim. To my suggestion that the county medical officer should take a look at Joseph and his sisters in the school, and that he might be able to give some help, her face lit up. "I only wants a hand," she says. "'Tis that old house and all the kids, and Arthur's no help, as you knows, miss. If he brought his money home regular, us might have a real house by now." I said that the medical officer might be able to pass their case forward to the housing committee. Something should be done, I promised her. "I wouldn't know where I was," she said wonderingly. She looked bemusedly about my kitchen, at the sink, the electric kettle, at the checkerboard tablecloth, and the breakfast food. Joseph returned with his mother to Tyler's Row, there to sleep in his own bed. "Let him come to school dinner if he's awake by then," I said to Mrs. Coggs as they went down the path, "and I won't forget to do what I can to help." And I should have done it long ago, I scolded myself as I collected a pile of books and made ready to go over to the school. I made up my mind to get in touch with the vicar that same day. 2 heads would be better than 1, as Mr. Willett no doubt would tell me. Between us, the desperate conditions at Tyler's Row should be lightened by some hope from the county authorities. Yes, I thought, remembering Mrs. Coggs, the worm had turned indeed, and as it later transpired, the fortune of the whole Coggs family, too. For before the end of the year, the council house, which had been home of old Shepherd Burton's family, became vacant, and the Coggs family was immediately moved in. Mrs. Coggs' newfound spirit glowed steadily in these surroundings. Arthur Coggs, in flabbergasted obedience to a court order, found himself handing over a fixed sum of money to his wife each week, and the whole of Fairacre voiced its approval. It was generally agreed that Joseph's rebellion on that stormy autumn evening had been a real blessing in disguise. And we will continue working our way through this autumn next time.